Everyone knows their name. Say it in the right room and people nod, not the polite nod of someone pretending to recognize something, but the deep, certain nod of someone who knows exactly who you are talking about, who has known for years, who learned the name the way you learn the names of real people and real places and real things that happened. Except they did not happen. Not the way people think. Not the way the story goes. Tonight we are going to some of the most famous figures in African legend, figures whose names have traveled across centuries and continents, whose stories have shaped kingdoms and inspired warriors and given entire peoples a sense of where they came from and who they are, and we are going to ask the question that almost nobody asks. Did they actually exist? And the answer in every case tonight is going to be more complicated, more interesting, and more human than a simple yes or no has any right to be. Because the truth about legendary figures is never just that they existed or that they did not. And tonight we are going to sit inside that complicated truth and find out what it actually means, what it means for the stories, for the people who told them, and for the deep, ancient, very human need to believe in someone extraordinary. Before we begin tonight, if this channel has been part of your quiet hours, if these stories have carried you somewhere real before sleep found you, then take one moment right now and subscribe, turn on that bell, and share this with one person who needs something true to rest their mind on tonight. This channel is built one listener at a time, and every person who joins this fire matters. Drop something in the comments. Tell us which African legend you grew up hearing about, the one that felt so real you never thought to question it. We want to know. Drop it below. Now let the story begin. The legend that became real enough to rule. There is a particular kind of story that does something extraordinary. It starts as a story, as something told around fires and in the spaces between sleeping and waking, in the mouths of grandmothers and the songs of traveling musicians and the careful, deliberate teachings of elders who understood that stories were not entertainment but instruction. And then, over time, over generations, over the slow accumulation of telling and retelling and embellishment and sincere belief, it becomes something else. It becomes real. Not real in the way that a stone is real or a river or a person you can touch, but real in the way that matters most to the people who live inside it, real in the way that shapes decisions and justifies power and gives a community its sense of itself, its sense of where it came from, its sense of what it is capable of. Real enough to rule by. Real enough to die for. Real enough that questioning it feels not like scholarship but like betrayal. Tonight's first legend is exactly this kind of story, and it comes from one of the most powerful and enduring traditions in all of African legend. The tradition that gave rise to a figure known across East Africa, across the entire Horn of Africa, and beyond it into the wider world, a figure whose name you may know, whose story you have probably heard, and whose actual historical existence is, when you look at it carefully, honestly, without the weight of tradition pressing on the looking, far more complicated than the story suggests. We are talking about the Queen of Sheba. Or rather, we are talking about Makeda, the Queen of Sheba as she is known in the Ethiopian tradition, the woman whose story is told in the Kebre Nagast, the great Ethiopian royal chronicle, the woman who is said to have traveled to Jerusalem to meet Solomon, to have borne his child, to have returned to her kingdom with the heir who would become the founder of the Solomonic dynasty. The royal line that Ethiopian emperors claimed as their legitimacy for nearly 3,000 years. Her name in the Ethiopian tradition is Makeda, and she is not presented as legend, not framed as myth or story or embellishment. She is presented as history, as the founding ancestor of the nation, as the woman whose encounter with Solomon produced Menelik I, the first king of the Solomonic line, and through Menelik the lineage that runs unbroken, in the official telling, all the way to Haile Selassie, who ruled Ethiopia until 1974, and whose claim to the throne rested, among other things, on his descent from this woman. This is extraordinary, and it needs to be understood in its full weight before we ask the harder question. This is not a story that was told for entertainment. It is not a story that was preserved because it was beautiful or interesting. It is a story that was preserved because it was the foundation of a political and spiritual order that lasted for centuries and that shaped the lives of millions of people. And the woman at the center of it, Makeda, the Queen of Sheba, was the legitimizing ancestor from whom all of that authority flowed. If she did not exist, everything built on her existence becomes something different. Not necessarily less legitimate. Power has always found its justifications, and the quality of governance is not determined by the mythological accuracy of the founding story. But different, and understanding that difference is the beginning of understanding what legends actually are and what they actually do. So what do we actually know? The story of the Queen of Sheba appears in multiple ancient traditions, not just the Ethiopian one, but the Hebrew Bible, the Quran, and various ancient Arabian sources, which is itself interesting, because a figure who appears in multiple independent traditions is more likely to have some historical basis than a figure who appears in only one. In the Hebrew Bible, the Queen of the South, she is not named there, travels to Jerusalem, tests Solomon's wisdom with difficult questions, is impressed by what she finds, exchanges gifts with him and departs, and the account is relatively brief and does not mention a child. In the Islamic tradition, she is known as Bilqis, and she appears in the Quran in the context of Solomon's story. And the tradition that developed around her in Islamic scholarship is rich and detailed and different in significant ways from the Ethiopian account. In the Ethiopian tradition, codified in the Kebra Nagast, which was compiled in its current form in the 14th century CE, but claims to draw on much older sources, Makeda is a queen of extraordinary power and wisdom ruling a kingdom called Sheba. She travels to Solomon, she is tricked into sleeping with him, she returns home pregnant, she bears a son named Menelik. Menelik eventually travels to Jerusalem to meet his father, and he returns to Ethiopia with the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest that the Hebrew Bible describes as containing the tablets of the law given to Moses. And the Ark has been in Ethiopia ever since, according to this tradition, housed in a church in Aksum where it remains to this day, guarded by a single monk who is the only person permitted to see it. This is a story of staggering scope and consequence, and it has been believed with complete sincerity by millions of people across many centuries, and its influence on Ethiopian history, culture, religion, and national identity is impossible to overstate. But was Makeda real? The honest answer is that we do not know, and the more carefully you look at the historical record, the more that uncertainty deepens rather than resolves. The kingdom of Sheba, or Saba as it appears in ancient sources, was real, and this matters because a real geographic and political context gives the legend something solid to attach itself to, and the absence of that context would make the historical question much simpler. The kingdom of Saba existed in the ancient world in the region that is now Yemen, in the southern Arabian Peninsula, and it was a significant trading kingdom, wealthy from the incense trade that ran through the region, connected to both the African and the Arabian sides of the Red Sea, sophisticated enough to have left its own inscriptions and monuments that archaeologists have studied. There was also significant ancient interaction between the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa. The cultures on both sides of the Red Sea were deeply intertwined in the ancient period. They spoke related languages, they shared religious practices, they moved back and forth across the water, and the ancient kingdom of Aksum, which dominated the Horn of Africa and is considered the predecessor of the Ethiopian state, had connections to the Sabaean world that are well documented in the archaeological record. So the historical context for a queen ruling in this part of the world in this period with connections to the ancient Near East including the Israelite kingdoms, This context is real and plausible. But a specific named Queen Makeda, ruling at the specific time of Solomon, around 950 BCE, with the specific history that the Kabra Nagast describes? The evidence for this specific figure is the Kabra Nagast itself, a document compiled more than 2,000 years after the events it describes, and the various ancient traditions that reference the Queen of the South without naming her or providing details consistent with the Ethiopian account. This is not nothing. Oral traditions can preserve genuine historical memory across very long periods, and the absence of independent corroborating documentation does not mean the tradition is fabricated. But it is also not the kind of evidence that historical scholarship recognizes as establishing that a specific person existed. What we have is a real historical context, a plausible scenario, a tradition of great antiquity and cultural significance, and a specific figure at the center of it whose historical existence cannot be confirmed and may never be. But here is what is genuinely fascinating about Makeda, and why she is the right figure to begin tonight with. The question of whether she existed as a historical person is, in a certain sense, the less interesting question. The more interesting question is what it means that millions of people believed she did, and built a civilization on that belief. The Solomonic dynasty that claimed descent from Makeda and her son Menelik used that claimed lineage as one of the primary legitimizing foundations of Ethiopian imperial rule, and this legitimization was not merely theoretical or ceremonial. It was woven into the religious life of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, into the constitutional structure of the imperial state, into the way Ethiopian people understood their relationship to the sacred, into the national identity that survived colonization. Attempts that felled almost every other African state. When Italy attempted to colonize Ethiopia at the end of the 19th century and was defeated at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, one of the most significant military victories in the history of African resistance to European imperialism, the Ethiopian forces who fought under Emperor Menelik II fought, among other things, as descendants of the line that stretched back to Makeda, as inheritors of a tradition that the Kabra Nagast had preserved, as people whose identity was inseparable from the founding story of their nation. Did the historical Makeda make that victory possible? Not directly, no. The tactical decisions, the military organization, the terrain, the weapons, the leadership, all of these were the immediate causes of the victory. But the identity that sustained the people who made those decisions, the sense of who they were and what they were defending and what lineage they carried, this was shaped in part by the story of a woman who may or may not have walked into Solomon's court 3,000 years before. Legends do not need to be historically true to be historically real in their effects. This is one of the most important things to understand about the figures we are going to discuss tonight, and Makeda illustrates it more clearly than almost anyone. There is one more dimension to Makeda's story that deserves attention before we move on, and it is a dimension that is often overlooked in the discussions that focus on the historical question. The way she is portrayed in the Kabra Nagast is not the portrayal of a passive or peripheral figure, not a woman who appears briefly to be impressed by a man and then disappears from the story, not a figure whose significance is entirely derived from her relationship to Solomon and her son. In the Ethiopian tradition, Makeda is a ruler in her own right, a woman of extraordinary intelligence and independent authority who sought out wisdom because she valued wisdom, who governed a wealthy and powerful kingdom by her own capability, who made her own decisions and whose story begins and ends with her own agency rather than with what a man gave her or did to her. The specific details of her portrayal, the wealth and sophistication of her court, the independence of her judgment, the respect accorded to her by the most powerful king in the ancient Near East, reflects something real about how the Ethiopian tradition understood women and power, and that reflection has value regardless of whether the specific woman at the center of it was a historical person. She may not have existed as the Cabra Nagas describes her, but the values her story embodies, the dignity of women in positions of authority, the legitimacy of African kingdoms in relation to the great powers of the ancient world, the spiritual significance of the Ethiopian people and their land, these values were real, and they were preserved and transmitted through her story, and they shaped the people who inherited them. A legend that does not exist in history but exists in the lives of the people who believe it. This is not a small thing, and it is not simply an error to be corrected. It is something that requires a more careful, more respectful, and more honest kind of attention than either simple belief or simple dismissal can provide. Let us move now to a different kind of legend, one that operates not through a royal founding narrative but through the accumulated mythology of a figure who became over time the symbolic embodiment of an entire way of life, an entire set of values, an entire vision of what a human being could be if they were everything that a particular culture most admired. The second legend, Sundiata Keita, the real man and the impossible story. Before we say anything else about Sundiata Keita, this must be said clearly. Sundiata Keita was almost certainly a real person. Unlike Makeda, whose historicity is genuinely uncertain, there is reasonable historical evidence for the existence of a ruler named Sundiata, who founded the Mali Empire in the 13th century CE, whose military victories over the Sasso kingdom under Semanguru Kanti established Mali as the dominant power in West Africa, and whose reign initiated a period of remarkable prosperity and cultural achievement that culminated, a generation later, in the famous pilgrimage of Musa Musa to Mecca in 1324, one of the most documented events in medieval African history. So Sundiata was probably real. But the Sundiata that everyone knows, the Sundiata of the great Mande epic, the Sundiata of the griots, the Sundiata who could not walk as a child and then rose to defeat the most powerful sorcerer king in the region and build the greatest empire West Africa had ever seen. This Sundiata, the legendary Sundiata, is not simply a historical figure with some embellishments around the edges. He is something fundamentally different from a historical figure. He is a legend of such completeness, such internal coherence, such mythological richness that separating the historical kernel from the legendary elaboration is not just difficult. It may be, in a meaningful sense, impossible. And understanding why it is impossible tells us something essential about how African oral tradition works, and why the question of historical accuracy is genuinely the wrong question to ask of a griot's epic. The story of Sundiata as it is told in the Mande oral tradition begins before his birth with a prophecy. The king of the Mande people, Nerefe Magan, is told by a hunter that a lion will come to him, a hunter without a kill, and that from the union of this king with the woman the hunter leads to him will come a son who will be greater than Alexander the Great, greater than any king who came before. The ruler who will unite all the peoples of the savannah under one great empire. The woman is Sagalan, described as ugly, as a woman with a hunchback, as someone whose external appearance conceals an extraordinary spiritual power. She carries a spirit, a nyama, that makes her both formidable and dangerous, and the king who marries her does so not because she is beautiful but because the prophecy has told him that she is necessary. Their son is born, and he is called Sundiata, the Lion Prince, but he cannot walk, and this is not a minor detail in the story. It is the central challenge around which the entire first half of the epic is organized, because a child who cannot walk in a society organized around physical capability and military power is a child whose promise seems impossible, whose destiny seems like a cruel joke, whose existence is a source of shame for his mother and mockery from the other wives of the king's household. Years pass and Sundiata does not walk, and the mockery intensifies, and the other wives, particularly the first wife, Sassouma Barit, whose son is the heir apparent, use his disability as a weapon against Sogolon, as evidence that her son will never amount to anything, that the prophecy was wrong, that the Lion Prince is nothing more than a child who cannot stand on his own feet. And then one day, and this is the moment that every griot knows, the moment that every listener waits for, the moment that has been told and retold across centuries with the same essential shape, even as the specific details vary between different griot traditions. Sundiata asks for an iron bar, and he grasps it with both hands, and he rises, and the iron bar bends under the force of his rising, and he stands, and for the first time in his life he walks. The moment is so freighted with meaning, so compressed with everything the story has been building toward, that it functions not as a physical event but as a cosmic one. The revelation of what was always there, the manifestation of the destiny that the prophecy described, the moment when the impossible proves itself not only possible but inevitable. From this point the story accelerates through a series of events. Exile, wandering, growth in foreign kingdoms, the development of Sundiata's military capability and his network of allies, the rise of Semanguru Khanty as the tyrant who has conquered the Mande homeland and must be defeated, that culminate in the Battle of Karina around 1235 CE, where Sundiata defeats Semanguru and establishes the foundation of the Mali Empire. The historical core of this, a military leader named Sundiata defeating a ruler named Semanguru and establishing Mali as a regional power in the mid-13th century, is supported by external sources, including the account of the Arab historian Ibn Khaldun, who wrote about Mali in the 14th century and whose sources included information about the empire's founding. So the battle probably happened. The empire probably was founded by a man named Sundiata. The basic political outline of the story has historical plausibility. But Semanguru in the epic is not simply a rival king. He is a sorcerer of terrible power, a man who has made a pact with spirits that makes him invulnerable to ordinary weapons, a king who rules through supernatural terror as much as through military force, and the key to defeating him is not simply military strategy but the discovery of his magical weakness. A specific talisman, a spur from a white rooster, that strips him of his supernatural protection and allows Sundiata's forces to prevail. This is the structure of myth, not of history. The hero's quest for the enemy's secret weakness, the magical object that defeats the seemingly undefeatable foe, the supernatural dimensions of a conflict that is simultaneously political and cosmic. And the griot who tells this story is not confused about the difference between history and myth, is not making a factual error by including the supernatural elements, is not operating under a misapprehension that could be corrected by better historical research. The griot is doing something different from history. The griot is doing something that history cannot do. The Mande oral tradition, the tradition that has preserved and transmitted the Sundiata epic across 8 centuries, operates according to a logic that is fundamentally different from the logic of historical documentation, and this difference is not a deficiency of the oral tradition, it is a feature of it, a deliberate and sophisticated choice about what kind of truth a story is supposed to carry. The griots, the jelly, the hereditary caste of musicians and oral historians who have been the custodians of this tradition, are not simply memorizing and reciting a fixed text. They are living participants in a tradition that they reshape and adapt for every performance, every audience, every context, bringing their own interpretation and emphasis and elaboration to a story whose essential structure they have inherited, but whose specific expression is always new. And what they are preserving is not primarily a factual account of what happened at Karina in 1235 CE. Though they are preserving that too in the sense that the basic historical outline is maintained, They are preserving a model of what a human being can be, what leadership means, how suffering can be transformed into strength, what the relationship between a person and their destiny looks like when that relationship is honored rather than fled. Sundiata could not walk, and he walked anyway. He was exiled, and he returned. He was told he would never be a king, and he became the greatest king his world had ever seen. These are not simply facts about a historical person. They are truths about what is possible, truths that have sustained the Mande people through their own exiles and their own disabilities and their own moments of being told that what they hope for cannot happen. The legendary Sundiata is more real than the historical Sundiata in this sense, not because the legend is more factually accurate, but because the legend carries more of what the tradition most needed to preserve and transmit, the deepest truths about resilience and destiny, and the gap between what seems impossible and what ultimately proves inevitable. There is a conversation that historians and cultural scholars have been having for decades about how to approach figures like Sundiata, how to hold simultaneously the historical inquiry, which asks what actually happened, and the cultural inquiry, which asks what the story means and does. And the most honest position in this conversation is that both approaches are necessary and neither is sufficient alone. A purely historical approach that strips away the legendary elements to find the kernel of documented fact produces something accurate and limited. A minor regional ruler whose military victories can be tentatively placed in a specific historical context, and whose specific personal history is irrecoverable. A purely cultural approach that treats the legend as sufficient unto itself and discourages historical inquiry produces something that cannot be questioned or examined. A sacred story whose authority rests on the very certainty that makes examining it feel like violation. What is needed is something more honest and more respectful than either. An approach that can say, this man probably existed, these events probably occurred in something like the form the tradition describes, and the story that has been built around this historical core is not simply embellishment or exaggeration. It is the tradition's way of saying what the event meant, what it revealed about human possibility, what truths it carried that bare fact alone could not convey. Sundiata was real, probably. The Sundiata who bends iron bars and defeats sorcerer kings. This Sundiata was made real by 8 centuries of griots, who understood that some truths can only be told in the language of legend. Both of these things are true. Both deserve to be held. Settle into the quiet of the night for a moment now, and let what you have heard so far find its level inside you, because we have covered a great deal of ground and there is more ahead. More figures, more legends, more of the complicated and deeply human story of how African traditions have created and sustained and lived inside stories that blur the line between history and myth in ways that are not confusion but wisdom. The fire is burning low now, soft and steady, and the story is nowhere near finished, but you are safe inside it, and your body is growing heavier, and the night is long and quiet, and there is nothing you need to do right now except rest inside what you are hearing, and let it carry you gently and completely deeper into the dark. The warriors who grew larger than the battles they fought. There is a specific kind of legend that grows not from a founding story or a royal genealogy, but from a battlefield, from the raw, immediate, emotionally overwhelming experience of watching someone do something in the heat of conflict that seems to go beyond what ordinary human beings are capable of, and the legend grows from that moment outward, backward into the person's origins and forward into their death and beyond it, until the person who actually stood on that actual field has been entirely surrounded by the story that the moment generated, and what remains is not a person at all but a symbol enormous and fixed, that carries the meaning of what was witnessed without being reducible to the specific human being who generated it. Tonight's next figures come from this tradition, the tradition of the legendary warrior, the fighter whose deeds in battle became so significant to the people who witnessed them and the people who inherited those witness accounts that the person at the center of the story has become, over time, something more and less than a human being, something that illuminates what the culture most valued and feared and hoped for in the extremity of conflict. We are going to begin with one of the most famous warrior figures in the history of the African continent, a figure whose name is known far beyond the specific cultural tradition that produced the legend, whose image has been reproduced and whose story has been told in contexts completely removed from the original, and whose actual historical existence, when you look at it with clear eyes, raises questions that the popular telling of the story almost never asks. The third legend, Nzinga of Ndongo, the queen who became a god of war. Queen Nzinga was real. This must be said immediately and clearly because unlike Makeda and unlike some of the figures we will discuss later tonight, Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, the Mbunda queen who fought the Portuguese colonization of what is now Angola in the 17th century, who negotiated and fought and outmaneuvered the most powerful European empire of her age for decades, who is remembered as one of the greatest resistance leaders in African history. This woman existed, her life is documented in Portuguese colonial records, in the accounts of Italian missionaries who met her, in the correspondence she herself sent to European rulers and to the Pope, and the broad outline of her extraordinary life is as well documented as the life of any African historical figure of her era. Nzinga was real, and Nzinga was remarkable, and the core of her story, the resistance, the diplomacy, the military leadership, the decades of struggle against Portuguese encroachment, is not legend in the sense of being invented or fabricated. But the Nzinga that people know, the Nzinga of popular imagination, the Nzinga of the stories told across Angola and across the African diaspora, the Nzinga who has become a symbol of African resistance and female power and unbreakable defiance. This Nzinga has been shaped by the same forces that shape all legendary figures. The forces of retelling and embellishment, and the projection of meaning onto a historical person, until the person becomes a vessel for values and hopes and identities that go far beyond anything she herself could have intended or understood. And some of the specific stories told about her, specific incidents, specific acts, specific moments that have become the defining images of her legend, are almost certainly not historically accurate, and examining them carefully tells us a great deal about what legends do to real people, and why the transformation happens, and what it costs, and what it preserves. The most famous single image associated with Nzinga is the image of the chair. The story goes like this. Nzinga traveled to Luanda in 1622 to negotiate with the Portuguese governor, João Correia de Souza, on behalf of her brother, the King of Ndongo, and when she arrived for the negotiation, the Portuguese governor sat in a chair while no chair was provided for her, a deliberate protocol insult, designed to establish the Portuguese as superior and Nzinga as a supplicant rather than an equal negotiating party. And Nzinga's response was immediate and devastating. She ordered one of her attendants to kneel on hands and knees, and she sat on the attendant's back as her chair, meeting the governor's eyes from a position of equal height and refusing, completely and visibly and without a word of complaint, to accept the subordinate position the protocol insult was designed to force on her. This image, Nzinga seated on a human chair, meeting her adversary as an equal, has become one of the most powerful and widely reproduced images in the iconography of African resistance, painted and sculpted and referenced in literature and film and political speech across centuries and continents, and its power is completely understandable because what it represents, the immediate, creative, unilateral refusal of a symbolic humiliation, is genuinely powerful, genuinely admirable, genuinely the kind of act that deserves to be remembered and celebrated. The problem is that there is no contemporary documentation of this specific incident. The earliest account of the chair story appears in sources written significantly after the event it describes, and the historical record of the 1622 negotiation, which is documented in Portuguese colonial records, does not include this detail, and historians who have examined the question carefully have generally concluded that the chair story is almost certainly legendary, a story that grew up around Nzinga's real historical importance, and that captures something true about her character and her approach to the power dynamics of her situation, without necessarily describing something that literally happened. This does not make the story worthless. In fact, it makes it more interesting, because a story that communities create around a real historical figure to express what they understand about that figure's significance is itself a kind of evidence about values and understanding and the specific qualities that the tradition identified in Nzinga as most worth preserving and celebrating. The chair story says she refused subordination, she found creative ways to assert equality, she turned the tools of her adversaries against them without losing her composure or her dignity. And all of these things are supported by the historical record of her actual life, even if the specific incident may not have happened precisely as the story tells it. The legend is truer than the history in the sense that it identifies, more clearly and more memorably than any list of documented facts can, what was most significant about this person and why she mattered. There are other elements of the Nzinga legend that are similarly complicated. Stories of her military prowess that have grown in the telling, accounts of her spiritual power and her relationship with the religious traditions of her people that blend documented fact with legendary elaboration, specific incidents in the long decades of her resistance that appear in some traditions and not others, and whose historical basis is difficult or impossible to establish. She is said to have dressed as a man, to have led her soldiers personally into battle at an age when most people of any gender would have withdrawn from physical combat, to have maintained her defiance with absolute consistency through imprisonment and exile and the deaths of family members and the losses of territory and the betrayals of allies, to have negotiated with the Portuguese and then fought them, and then negotiated again with a flexibility and pragmatism that was always in service of the fundamental goal, the preservation of her people's independence and dignity. The historical record supports the broad shape of all of this, even where it does not confirm the specific details of every story. And what is remarkable about Nzinga is that the historical Nzinga, the one visible in the documents, is already so extraordinary that the legend does not need to invent much. It only needs to emphasize and clarify and make vivid what was already there. She ruled from approximately 1624 until her death in 1663, governing for nearly 40 years through conditions of extraordinary difficulty, and she died at approximately 80 years old, still ruling, still negotiating, having outlasted multiple Portuguese governors, multiple European political situations, multiple configurations of the conflict that defined her reign. The woman who emerges from the historical record is already, without any legendary elaboration, one of the most remarkable political figures of the 17th century anywhere in the world, not just in Africa, not just among women, but by any standard applied to any person operating in conditions of comparable difficulty and complexity. The legend grew because it had something extraordinary to grow around, and the gap between the historical Nzinga and the legendary Nzinga is smaller than the gap for most figures of comparable legendary status, and this itself is meaningful. It suggests that the tradition that preserved her memory was responding to something genuinely there, something that did not require invention so much as amplification. The fourth legend, Shaka Zulu. The man inside the myth. Shaka Zulu was real. He was born approximately in 1787. He ruled as king of the Zulu people from approximately 1816 until his assassination in 1828. He transformed the Zulu from a relatively minor chieftaincy into a significant regional power through military and political reforms that have been studied by historians and military theorists for nearly 2 centuries. And his reign initiated a period of dramatic disruption across southern Africa. The Mfikane, the Great Scattering, whose consequences shaped the political landscape of the region for generations. The broad historical outline of Shaka's life is well documented by comparison to many figures of comparable antiquity, documented not just in Zulu oral tradition, but in the accounts of European traders and travelers who encountered him directly, including Henry Finn and Nathaniel Isaacs, whose written accounts of the Zulu kingdom in Shaka's time are primary historical sources of real, if complicated, value. So Shaka was real and significant, and the core of his historical importance is documented in ways that make the historical question relatively straightforward compared to Makeda or even Sundiata. But the Shaka of popular imagination, the Shaka of the television dramatizations and the popular histories and the nationalist mythology and the regional legend, is not simply a historical person with some dramatic embellishments. He is a figure of such towering mythological proportions that the historical person inside the myth has become almost impossible to see clearly, surrounded on all sides by the accumulated projections of people who needed him to be something specific, a military genius of superhuman capability, a tyrant of supernatural cruelty, a proto-nationalist who unified his people against future colonization, a monster whose violence was unprecedented in the region's history, and who shaped the story to fit what they needed. And here is where Shaka's legend becomes particularly interesting and particularly complicated because the distortions in the Shaka legend came not primarily from the Zulu tradition but from outside it, from the accounts of European writers who had their own reasons for portraying Shaka in specific ways. And the legend that resulted is not simply a case of African oral tradition generating mythological elaboration around a historical core, but a case of colonial historiography generating a specific image of an African ruler that served specific colonial purposes, and then that image being absorbed into the popular understanding of Shaka so thoroughly that it is now almost inseparable from any discussion of who he actually was. The specific distortions in the Shaka legend are worth examining carefully, because they illustrate something important about how legends are not only created from within traditions but imposed from outside them, and how the two kinds of legend-making interact in ways that are difficult to untangle. Nathaniel Isaacs, one of the two primary European sources for Shaka's reign, is now known to have substantially embellished his accounts. His published narrative, written years after his time in the Zulu kingdom, contains dramatic scenes and quotations and incidents that historians comparing his later published account with his contemporary journals have identified as inventions or significant exaggerations, added after the fact to create a more dramatic and commercially appealing narrative. Isaacs had a financial interest in portraying the Zulu kingdom in a specific way, as a land of terror and opportunity, a place of dramatic savagery that required European intervention and offered European opportunity, and his account of Shaka reflects this interest, emphasizing the violence and the arbitrariness and the scale of killing in ways that historians of Zulu history now regard with considerable skepticism. The image of Shaka as a ruler of unprecedented and pathological cruelty, an image that became standard in European accounts and that influenced popular understanding of his reign for generations, is substantially a product of these early European sources, sources whose reliability is seriously compromised by the motivations of the people who wrote them and the distance in time between the events and the writing. This does not mean Shaka was not capable of violence. The historical evidence for violence in his reign is real, and the disruptions of the Mfikane period were genuine and consequential and involved real suffering for real people, but the specific scale and character of the violence described in the most dramatic European accounts, and the specific narrative of Shaka as a kind of African tyrant whose instability and brutality explain the necessity of the colonial intervention that followed. This narrative was constructed from sources that cannot be trusted at face value, and that serve the interests of people with strong reasons to portray him in precisely the most damning light available. The Zulu tradition's own account of Shaka is different, not a sanitized account that removes all the difficult elements, but a more complex account that holds both the military genius and the political ruthlessness and the genuine achievements and the personal tragedy in a relationship that is more human and less mythological than the European colonial portrait, more honest about the specific historical context that shaped both his methods and his legacy. The Shaka of Zulu oral tradition is a man who was illegitimate, born outside the formal recognition of his father's household, raised in his mother Nandi's family rather than at his father's court, shaped by the specific social vulnerability that his irregular birth created in a society where status and legitimacy were closely related, and whose military and political innovations were responses not just to external challenges but to the internal logic of his own position, the position of someone who had to build authority from a foundation that his birth had not provided him. This Shaka is more interesting than the mythological monster of the colonial accounts, and also more interesting than the nationalist hero of the 20th century mythologizing that emerged in response to those colonial accounts. He is a person whose extraordinary capabilities and whose significant moral complexity both make sense in the context of a specific life shaped by specific historical forces. And the legend that surrounds him, the accumulated stories of his military innovations, his personal bravery, his relationships with the people closest to him, his grief after his mother's death, the specific character of his relationship with his people. This legend preserves things about him that the historical documents, mostly written by people with limited understanding of and limited sympathy for the Zulu world, cannot preserve. Both the historical record and the legendary tradition are necessary for anything approaching a full picture, and neither alone is sufficient, and the willingness to hold both without collapsing them into each other is what honest engagement with a figure like Shaka requires. The fifth legend, Kikuyu and Mumbai. The ancestors who made a people. The Kikuyu people of Kenya, one of the largest ethnic groups in East Africa, the people of Jomo Kenyatta, the founding president of independent Kenya, the people whose land and traditions became one of the central contested spaces of the colonial encounter in the 20th century, trace their origins to a founding couple named Gikuyu and Mumbai, the man and woman from whom all Kikuyu people are descended. The story as it is told in the Kikuyu tradition begins with God, Nai, the supreme being of Kikuyu belief, who called Gikuyu to the top of the mountain that is now known as Mount Kenya, the sacred mountain at the center of the Kikuyu world, and showed him the land that would belong to his descendants, the fertile highland country that the Kikuyu have farmed for generations, and gave him a wife named Mumbai, whose name means creator or molder, and from Gikuyu and Mumbai came 9 daughters. 9 daughters whose names became the names of the 9 clans of the Kikuyu people, so that every Kikuyu person alive today belongs to a clan whose name is the name of one of Mumbai's daughters. This is a founding origin story in the most complete sense, not just a story about where the people came from, but a story that encodes within it the entire social structure of the people, the clan system that organizes Kikuyu society, in the names of the founding ancestors' children. Did Gikuyu and Mumbai exist as historical people? Almost certainly not, in the sense of 2 specific individuals from whom all Kikuyu people are literally descended. The Kikuyu people, like all peoples, arrived at their present form through a complex, centuries-long process of migration, intermarriage, cultural exchange, conflict, and gradual differentiation from related groups. a process that no two-person founding story can accurately describe, and that no specific founding couple could have initiated. But the question of whether Gikuyu and Mumbai were historical individuals is again genuinely the less interesting question. The more interesting question is what the story does, what work it performs in the life of the people who tell it, and here the answer is rich and specific and worth taking seriously. The story establishes the land, the specific, particular, irreplaceable highland land of central Kenya, as a gift from God to a specific people, a gift with a history and a meaning that cannot be separated from the identity of the people who received it, and this establishment of the relationship between people and land through a sacred founding narrative became, in the context of colonial land alienation in Kenya, not just a cultural tradition but a political argument, a claim about belonging and legitimacy, and the rights of a people to the land that God showed their ancestor from the top of the sacred mountain. When the British colonial administration began taking Kikuyu land in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, settling European farmers on land that Kikuyu families had farmed for generations, reclassifying occupied and used land as empty and available, creating the conditions that would eventually lead to the Mau Mau uprising of the 1950s. The Kikuyu response to this dispossession was articulated in terms that drew directly on the founding narrative, on the relationship between Gikuyu and Mumbai and God and the land, on the sacred significance of the specific territory that the colonial administration was treating as simply property to be allocated. Jomo Kenyatta, writing in 1938 in his foundational text Facing Mount Kenya, analyzed the Kikuyu founding tradition with the dual perspective of an anthropologist trained at the London School of Economics and a Kikuyu man whose own identity was inseparable from the tradition he was describing, and what he produced was not simply a record of a cultural tradition but an argument that the Kikuyu relationship to their land was not merely economic or practical but sacred, historical, and inalienable in ways that the colonial framework could not understand and had not tried to understand. The legendary ancestors Gikuyu and Mumbai, who almost certainly never existed as historical individuals, were doing active political work in the 20th century, their story a tool of resistance against a dispossession that was entirely real and entirely contemporary. There is a thread that runs through all five of the legends we have discussed tonight: Makeda, Sundiata, Nzinga, Shaka, Gikuyu, and Mumbai. A thread that connects them despite the differences in their specific stories and their specific cultural origins and their specific historical periods. And that thread is this: every one of these legends is doing something that history alone cannot do. History can tell you what happened, approximately with the sources available, with the limitations imposed by who kept records and whose records survived and whose perspective shaped the records that exist. But history cannot tell you what it means, not in the deep sense, not in the sense that shapes how people understand themselves and their relationship to each other and to the land and to the forces that govern their lives. That is what legend does. Legend takes what happened or what might have happened or what people needed to have happened, and it asks what it means, and it answers that question in the language of story, in the language that human beings have always used to carry meaning across generations, the language of characters and conflict and transformation, and the revelation of what is possible when a person or a people decides to be who they most deeply are. The figures we have discussed tonight may not have existed in precisely the forms their legends describe, and in some cases the historical person at the center of the legend is barely visible beneath the accumulated weight of the story that has been built around them. But the legends themselves are not errors and not failures and not things to be corrected by better historical research. They are achievements. The achievement of communities that looked at their history and their values and their understanding of human possibility, and found the right stories to carry those things forward in a form that would last. Let the night settle around you now, soft and warm and full of the particular quiet that comes after a long day, and let what you have heard rest inside you without the need to do anything with it, and let your breathing find its own slow rhythm, and let the fire burn lower in your mind, the soft glow of it enough to see by without being bright enough to keep you from the sleep that your body has been waiting for. And the story continues on the other side of this quiet. There is more to come. More legends, more figures, more of the complicated and beautiful and deeply human story of how a continent told itself who it was and what it was capable of. And it will be there when you are ready for it, patient and steady, waiting in the dark the way the best stories always wait. The healers and the holy ones. There is a category of legendary figure that is different from the warrior and different from the founding ancestor and different from the royal lineage holder. A category that operates in a space that is harder to examine than any of the others, because the figures who inhabit it derive their authority not from what they did on a battlefield or in a throne room, but from what they were said to be able to do in the invisible world, the world of spirit and healing and the deep forces that ordinary people could feel but not see and could not approach without someone who understood the territory. These are the legendary healers, the holy figures, the prophets and the diviners and the people of power whose stories carry a particular kind of charge. A charge that makes the historical question not just difficult, but, for the communities who hold these traditions, potentially threatening in a way that the historical questions about warriors and ancestors are not. Because to question whether a healer had the powers attributed to them is not simply to question a biography, it is to question the entire framework of belief that the powers were embedded in, and that is a different kind of challenge, requiring a different kind of care. Tonight's segment is going to require that care, and it is going to ask you to hold something genuinely difficult. The simultaneous respect for traditions that are sacred to the people who hold them and the honest inquiry that these traditions deserve from anyone who takes them seriously enough to actually think about them rather than simply accepting or dismissing them, and both of these things are possible at the same time. And holding both of them together is not contradiction but intellectual honesty. The sixth legend, Moremi Ajasoro. The woman who saved the Yoruba and the price she paid. The story of Moremi Ajasoro is one of the most beloved and most celebrated in the entire Yoruba tradition. A tradition that is itself one of the richest and most complex in all of Africa. The tradition that gave the world the Orisha religion and its many descendants in the diaspora. The tradition whose mythology and philosophy and artistic production have shaped not just Nigeria and Benin, but the Americas and the Caribbean, and wherever the enslaved Yoruba people carried their culture across. The ocean. In this tradition, Moremi is not a minor figure. She is a woman of such significance that a festival is held in her honor in Ile-Ife, the sacred city that Yoruba tradition considers the origin point of human civilization, the place where Oduduwa descended from the heavens and created the earth, and from whom all Yoruba people are descended. And the festival of Moremi has been celebrated there for centuries. The story told and retold is a story of sacrifice and love, and the price that heroism extracts from the people who are called to it. The story goes like this. The people of Ile-Ife were under terrible threat from a neighboring people called the Igbo, who were raiding the Ife kingdom with devastating regularity, and against whom conventional resistance was proving ineffective, and Moremi, a beautiful and courageous woman who is described in the tradition as the wife of the Uni, the king of Ife, decided to do what no one else had done or dared to do, which was to allow herself to be captured by the Igbo raiders, to live among them, to learn their secrets, and to bring that knowledge back to her people so that the raids could finally be stopped. She made a vow to the river goddess Asimran, a promise that if she succeeded in her mission she would give the goddess whatever the goddess asked of her in return, and then she allowed herself to be captured, and she was taken to the Igbo people, and because of her extraordinary beauty and her intelligence, she rose quickly in their estimation, until she had access to the knowledge she had come for. The knowledge that the fearsome warriors who had been terrorizing Ife were not the supernatural beings they appeared to be, but men dressed in costumes of dried grass and raffia, whose terrifying appearance was theater, and whose vulnerability to fire was the secret that would defeat them. She escaped. She brought the knowledge back to Ife, and on the next raid the Ife people set fire to the raffia costumes of the warriors, and the raids ended and the kingdom was saved. And then the goddess asked for what she had been promised. And what the goddess asked for was Marimi's only son, her beloved son Oluwarogbo, and Moremi gave him. And the sacrifice of the beloved child is the part of the story that the tradition holds most tenderly, the part that makes Moremi not simply a hero but a figure of tragic grandeur, someone who paid the highest price a parent can pay for the sake of her people. Was Moremi Ajasoro a historical person? The tradition treats her as historical. She is presented not as a mythological figure from the deep past, but as a specific woman in a specific historical situation, a woman whose actions had specific political and military consequences that can be placed within the history of Ile-Ife and the surrounding region. But the historical record for the specific events of Marimi's story, the raids, the infiltration, the vow to the river goddess, the sacrifice of her son, does not exist outside the tradition itself, and the period in which the story is set is far enough in the past that independent corroboration is not available and may never be. What the tradition does preserve, and what archaeology and historical research have supported, is the historical reality of Ile-Ife as a center of political and cultural significance in the Yoruba world, with a documented history of conflict with neighboring peoples and a documented tradition of significant women in positions of political and religious authority. The specific Moremi, the woman who volunteered for capture and made the vow and paid the price. This specific person may have been historical, and may have done something whose memory the tradition preserved and elaborated over centuries. Or she may be a figure created entirely to embody specific values and specific understandings of what heroism and sacrifice and the relationship between individual and community require of the people who are called to them. What is not in doubt is what the story does. The story of Moremi tells the Yoruba tradition something about what women are capable of, not the softened, domesticated version of female capability that many traditions settle for, but the full version, the version that includes courage in the face of physical danger and strategic intelligence and the willingness to make sacrifices that men in the tradition are rarely asked to make in quite this way. The sacrifice of the beloved child, the giving up of the most personal and precious thing in service of the communal good. The story of Moremi is a story about what love costs when it is serious, about the gap between heroism as an idea and heroism as a lived reality that extracts payment from the hero in proportion to the significance of what is being protected, and this truth, this deeply uncomfortable, deeply important truth, is what the tradition has been preserving and transmitting through the story, and the truth does not depend on the historical accuracy of the specific details for its power or its validity. The seventh legend, Shaka the prophet. Not the warrior, the other one. There is a figure in the Zulu tradition who is sometimes confused with Shaka the king. A confusion that is understandable given the similarity of the names in some transliterations, but that obscures something important about the different kinds of legendary figures a tradition produces. This is the figure known in some versions of the tradition as a prophet, a figure who saw things that others could not see, who predicted events before they occurred, who understood the movements of history with a clarity that ordinary people did not possess, and that the tradition attributed to a special relationship with the spiritual forces that govern the world. The prophetic tradition in Southern African cultures, The tradition of the Isangoma and the Izanyanga, the diviners and the healers whose ability to access information from the spirit world was the foundation of their authority, produced its own legendary figures, people whose specific prophecies and specific powers became the subject of stories that grew in the telling until the historical person, if there was one, became difficult to locate within the accumulated weight of the legend. The specific prophetic figures of the Zulu and Xhosa and Sotho traditions, figures like Nsikana, the Xhosa visionary of the early 19th century whose story blends historical documentation with legendary elaboration in ways that historians and theologians have been debating for 2 centuries, or the various prophetic figures associated with the Anguni resistance traditions of southern Africa. These figures occupy a particularly complex space in the legend-making process because their authority in the tradition rested specifically on their access to non-ordinary knowledge, and testing that claim historically is not simply difficult, but involves a fundamental question about what kind of evidence could possibly bear on it. Nsikana is worth pausing on specifically, because his story illustrates something important about how legends form around figures who operated at the intersection of the indigenous spiritual tradition and the colonial encounter, a particularly charged space that generated particularly powerful and particularly distorted legend-making. Nsikana was a Xhosa man of the early 19th century who underwent a significant spiritual experience, possibly connected to his encounter with Christian missionary influence, possibly drawing on indigenous Xhosa spiritual traditions, almost certainly a combination of both, and who became a preacher and a prophet among his people in the years of intensifying colonial pressure on the Xhosa world, a figure who told his followers to abandon certain traditional practices and gather for communal worship, and who composed a hymn, the great hymn Ulo Thixo Omkulu, that is considered one of the first original compositions in the Xhosa language and that is still sung in South African churches today. The historical documentation for Nsikana is better than for many comparable figures. He is mentioned in missionary records of the period, and his life can be placed within a reasonably well-documented historical context. But the legend that grew around him after his death transformed a complicated, historically specific person whose spiritual journey was shaped by the particular pressures of a particular historical moment into a pure prophetic figure, a man of God whose insights were entirely divinely given and whose story was retold as a straightforward account of prophecy fulfilled. The difficult historical complexity smoothed away in favor of the cleaner, more powerful narrative of the chosen man who saw what was coming and tried to prepare his people. The process by which historical complexity is smoothed away in the creation of legendary figures is worth spending time on, because it is one of the most consistent and most revealing features of how legends work across all cultural traditions, including the African ones we are exploring tonight. Historical people are complicated in ways that legends cannot accommodate without sacrificing the clarity that makes legends useful. A real person operates in a specific historical context, shaped by forces that the person did not choose and could not fully understand, making decisions under conditions of uncertainty and incomplete information and competing pressures, sometimes right and sometimes wrong, sometimes brave and sometimes cautious, sometimes generous and sometimes self-interested, always particular. This specific person in this specific situation with these specific limitations and capabilities. A legendary figure cannot be this particular, cannot be this complicated, because the job of a legendary figure is not to represent a specific historical person, but to represent a set of values and possibilities that the tradition most needs to preserve, and this representation requires a kind of clarity and consistency that actual human beings do not have. So the legend smooths, and what it smooths away is almost always the same thing. The uncertainty, the failure, the compromise, the ordinariness, the moments when the legendary figure was not legendary at all, but simply a person doing what they could with what they had in circumstances that did not cooperate with their best intentions. What remains after the smoothing is a figure of impossible consistency, brave without exception, wise without failure, powerful without limitation, committed without wavering, and this figure is more useful to the tradition than the complicated historical person would be, because the tradition does not need a complicated historical person, it needs a model of possibility, a demonstration that a human being can be what the tradition most values, and the model has to be clear enough and consistent enough to actually function as a model. The eighth legend, Mami Wata. The spirit who became a person became a spirit. Mami Wata is not exactly a legend of a person who never existed. She is something more complex and more interesting than that. A figure who exists explicitly in the spiritual dimension, who has always been understood as a spirit rather than a historical human being, but whose legend has become so elaborate and so specific, and so intertwined with real historical events and real cultural encounters, that the question of her origins opens up into one of the most fascinating stories in the history of African spiritual tradition. Mami Wata, the name itself is a creolization of the English words mother water. Evidence right there in the name of the linguistic history encoded in the tradition, is a water spirit revered across a vast stretch of Africa and the African diaspora, present in the spiritual traditions of West Africa, Central Africa, Southern Africa, and throughout the Atlantic world wherever Africans were carried by the slave trade and carried their spiritual traditions with them. She is typically described as a beautiful woman, often with the lower body of a fish or a serpent, associated with the water and with wealth and with the deep ambivalent power of the sea, a power that gives and takes, that enriches and destroys, that is present in the tradition as something to be respected and negotiated with rather than simply appealed to or feared. The historical question about Mami Wata is not whether she exists as a spirit. That question belongs to a different kind of inquiry than the historical one, but where the specific form of the tradition came from, how a spirit revered across such an enormous geographic and cultural range came to have such specific and consistent features. And the answer to this historical question is genuinely surprising and genuinely illuminating about how cultural traditions form and travel and transform. Researchers studying the iconography of Mami Wata across different African and diaspora traditions notice something striking. The specific visual representation of Mami Wata that has become standard across a wide range of traditions, the beautiful woman with a snake, the specific pose, the specific visual language. This representation traces back in significant part to a specific European image, a chromolithograph of a snake charmer that was produced in Hamburg in the late 19th century and distributed widely across the coast of West Africa through trade networks, where it was absorbed into existing water spirit traditions and became, over time, one of the defining images of Mami Wata across the continent. A European commercial image, produced for entirely secular purposes and distributed through colonial trade networks, became the visual template for an African spiritual tradition of enormous cultural significance, absorbed into a pre-existing spiritual understanding and transformed by it into something that the Hamburg lithographers could not possibly have imagined. This is not a story about African traditions being derivative or dependent on European sources. It is a story about the extraordinary creative power of living traditions, their ability to absorb material from wherever it comes and transform it into something that serves their own deepest purposes, their flexibility and dynamism and responsiveness to the world they exist in. The Mami Wata who absorbed the Hamburg lithograph is the same Mami Wata who absorbed the visual language of Hindu goddesses, whose tradition traveled to West Africa through the Indian Ocean trade routes, and whose iconography of beautiful multi-armed female divinity found its way into the Mami Wata tradition through the same process of creative absorption and transformation. She is a spirit who has never been human, and whose legend is partly the legend of how a spirit tradition incorporates the world it moves through, taking in the images and the encounters and the histories that cross its path and making them part of itself, giving them meaning within a framework that predates any of the specific elements it has absorbed, and that will continue long after any specific element becomes outdated. The ninth legend, the lost king of Monomotapa. The ruler everyone knew and nobody knew. Among the most persistent and most distorted legends in the history of African civilization is the legend of the great ruler of Monomotapa. The kingdom of Great Zimbabwe and its successors, the realm whose stone ruins inspired such disbelief among European observers that they generated entire alternative histories to explain them, attributing them to the Queen of Sheba or to ancient Phoenician traders or to any source except the African people who actually built them. The legendary ruler of Monomotapa occupied a specific place in the European imagination of Africa from the 16th century onward. A figure of enormous wealth and mysterious power, a king whose realm contained the mines of Ophir, the source of Solomon's gold, a ruler of a civilization so sophisticated that it confirmed everything the European imagination wanted to believe about a lost golden age of African greatness that had somehow disappeared by the time Europeans arrived. The actual history of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe and its successors is rich and documented and complex in the way that real history always is. The Shona-speaking people who built Great Zimbabwe and who founded the successive kingdoms that Europeans called Monomotapa were real, their political structures were real, their gold trade was real and economically significant on a regional scale. Their cultural and architectural achievements were real, and were built not in a distant golden age but in a specific historical period by specific historical people. But the legendary Monomotapa, the great mystery king whose realm was somehow different from and separate from the ordinary historical reality of the African people living in that region, this figure was a European legend projected onto an African landscape, a legend that served specific European purposes at a specific historical moment, telling a story about Africa that allowed Europeans to simultaneously express wonder at the ruins of Great Zimbabwe and deny that those ruins were the product of the African people who were present when Europeans first arrived. The legend of Monomotapa is therefore not an African legend in the same sense as Makeda or Sundiata. It is a colonial legend, a legend imposed on Africa from outside rather than generated from within, but it operates by the same mechanisms as all legends, using selective evidence and motivated interpretation, and the human tendency to find in stories what we need to find. And its persistence across centuries of European writing about Africa makes it as important to understand as any of the indigenous traditions we have examined. Because the legends that outsiders tell about a people are not neutral, they have consequences, they shape policy and scholarship and popular understanding, they influence how a people is seen and treated and what is done to them in the name of what they are supposed to be. The legend of Monomotapa denied the Shona people credit for their own civilization. The legend of the savage continent denied African people credit for their own humanity. And the legends that replaced these, the counter-legends created by African people and their allies to reclaim the history that colonial legend-making had distorted, Makeda as founding ancestor, Sundiata as the hero of the people, Nzinga as the unbreakable resistance fighter. These counter-legends were not simply corrections of the historical record. They were responses to the specific harm of colonial legend-making. They were the tradition doing what traditions always do when they are under pressure, generating the stories that the people most need to sustain themselves in the circumstances they actually face. All of this brings us to something that has been present in tonight's conversation from the very beginning, but that we have not said directly yet. something about the relationship between legend and identity that explains why these stories matter so much to the people who hold them, and why the question of historical accuracy, while genuinely important, is never the only important question, and is sometimes not even the most important one. Identity, the sense of who you are, where you come from, what you are capable of, what your people have done and can do, is not built from historical facts alone, and never has been, not in any culture or any tradition anywhere in the world. It is built from stories, and the stories that build it are chosen not simply because they are accurate, but because they are true in the deeper sense, true to the values and the self-understanding and the possibilities that a community needs to believe in to sustain itself through whatever it is facing. Every community does this, and the communities that have faced the specific pressures that African communities have faced, the specific history of colonization and enslavement and cultural destruction and the systematic denial of historical achievement and human dignity, these communities have had particularly urgent reasons to choose their stories carefully, to preserve and amplify the legends that affirmed what the surrounding colonial world was trying to deny, and to protect those legends from the kind of easy dismissal that the colonial framework made available. The historical question, did this person exist, did this event happen, is a real and important question, and asking it honestly is not disrespect, but the deepest kind of engagement, the engagement that takes the tradition seriously enough to actually think about it. But the question of what the legend does, what it has meant to the people who have told it, what it has given them, what it has helped them survive and resist and build, this question is equally real and equally important, and ignoring it in favor of the purely historical inquiry produces an incomplete and ultimately dishonest picture of what these legends actually are. They are not simply history that has been distorted by poor record-keeping or wishful thinking. They are something more sophisticated than that. They are a form of knowledge, a way of carrying and transmitting understanding about what is possible and what is valuable and what a people most deeply believes about itself, encoded in stories because stories are the most durable and the most human container for that kind of knowledge. The legends we have discussed tonight and the ones we will discuss in the segments still to come are not failures of history, they are achievements of a different kind of intelligence. The intelligence that understands that people do not live by facts alone, that identity requires narrative, that a community without stories about itself is a community that has lost something essential about what it is. Let the night deepen around you now, soft and complete. The particular darkness of the late hours when the world has gone fully quiet, and even the sounds of the outside have settled into a low and distant murmur, barely enough to notice, barely enough to distinguish from silence, and let your breathing slow to the rhythm that your body finds on its own when it has been listened to for long enough. The slow, deep rhythm of a body approaching rest, and the story is carrying you now more than you are carrying it, and that is exactly right. That is what it is supposed to do, and there is more to come, more legends, more figures, more of the complicated and beautiful truth about what stories are and what they do, and it will be there when you are ready for it, patient and steady and warm. The tricksters, the wanderers, and the ones who came from nowhere. There is a particular kind of legendary figure that does not fit neatly into any of the categories we have explored so far tonight. Not a founding ancestor, not a warrior, not a healer, not a prophet, a figure who moves through the tradition in a different way, who cannot be pinned down to a specific historical moment or a specific political function, who appears and disappears and reappears in different forms across different cultures and different centuries, carrying the same essential character while wearing endlessly different costumes. These are the tricksters, the wanderers, the figures whose legends are defined not by a single great act or a founding moment, but by a quality of intelligence, of wit, of the ability to move between worlds and between rules and between the expectations that society places on people, to find the gap between what is supposed to happen and what actually happens and to slip through it laughing. They are some of the most loved figures in the entire range of African legendary tradition, and they are also, in a specific and interesting way, some of the most misunderstood. Misunderstood because the Western imagination tends to read the trickster as a minor figure, a comic relief character, a lightweight compared to the warriors and the founders and the holy ones. And this reading misses something essential about what the trickster tradition is and what it has meant to the communities that have held it and transmitted it across generations. The trickster is not comic relief. The trickster is a philosophical statement, a sustained, sophisticated, deeply serious engagement with the question of power, specifically with the question of how a person or a people who has less power than the forces arrayed against them can find a way to survive, to resist, to maintain their dignity and their agency in conditions that are designed to strip them of both. The trickster wins not through strength but through intelligence, and more than intelligence, through the particular kind of intelligence that sees through the pretensions of power, that recognizes that the rules of the powerful are not natural laws but human constructions that can be navigated around, that the emperor's clothes are visible as empty air to the person who looks at them without the desire to see what they are supposed to represent. This is not a minor philosophical position. In the specific historical context of African societies, which have spent centuries under various forms of external pressure, from the slave trade to colonization to the structural inequalities of the post-colonial present, the trickster tradition has carried something essential about how to remain human and effective and even joyful in conditions that are designed to make all three impossible. The 10th legend, Anansi, the spider who owns all stories. Anansi, the spider, the trickster, the figure who appears in the Akan tradition of Ghana and spread with the enslaved Akan people across the Caribbean and the Americas, becoming one of the most widely distributed legendary figures in the entire African diaspora, is perhaps the most famous trickster in the African legendary tradition, and his story raises questions about the nature of legendary existence that are different from any of the questions we have asked tonight. Because Anansi was never presented as a historical person. He is a spider and a spirit and a figure of pure story, and the Akan tradition does not claim that he walked the earth as a man in the way that the traditions around Makeda or Sundiata or Nzinga make historical claims. Anansi is explicitly a being of the legendary world, existing in the space where story and spirit and the deep forces of the world overlap. And his authority in the tradition rests not on historical credibility, but on something more fundamental, on the fact that he is the one who owns all stories, who acquired them from the sky god Niam by paying a price that seemed impossible, and who distributed them across the world as a gift to human beings. The story of how Anansi acquired all stories is itself one of the most beautiful and most philosophically rich stories in the entire African tradition, and it is worth telling fully and carefully because it illuminates something essential about what the Anansi tradition is and why it matters. Niam, the sky god, possessed all stories. All the stories in the world belonged to him, kept in a box in the sky, and no one could tell a story without his permission because all stories were his property. And the world without stories was a world of a specific kind of poverty, a world in which experience could not be shared or transmitted or made meaningful through the act of telling. Anansi wanted the stories, and he went to Niam and asked what the price was, and Niam, who knew what he was dealing with and who set the price specifically to make payment impossible, named three things: Onini the great python, Osibo the leopard, and the Maboro hornets, three creatures of genuine and formidable power, each of them capable of killing a spider without effort, each of them representing a kind of power that intelligence alone would seem unable to overcome. And Anansi paid. He brought Niam Onini the python, captured not through strength but through the exploitation of the python's vanity. A conversation about whether the python was truly as long as the branch beside him, a challenge to prove it by stretching himself out along the branch. And then, while the python was stretched and measuring himself against his own pride, the tying of the python to the branch with silk, so that when he realized what had happened it was too late. He brought Nyamosibo the leopard, captured through the exploitation of the leopard's curiosity. A pit dug in the path the leopard walked, covered lightly to conceal it, and when the leopard fell in, a rope of silk lowered down with a story attached to it, a story about helping, until the leopard was lifted into the trap of his own willingness to accept help from the wrong source. He brought Nyam the Maboro hornets, captured through the exploitation of the hornet's instinct to shelter from rain. A hollow gourd, a sprinkle of water from a leaf to simulate the beginning of a storm, and the hornets flowing into the gourd for shelter before they understood what was happening, sealed in before the understanding arrived. And Nyam looked at what Anansi had brought him, and he gave Anansi the stories, and from that day all stories belong to Anansi, and all the stories told anywhere in the world are Anansi's stories, told with his permission in his name. What this origin story encodes is not a historical claim but a philosophical one, and the philosophy is sophisticated enough to deserve careful attention. The three creatures that Anansi captured, the python, the leopard, the hornets, represent three different kinds of power that Anansi should not have been able to overcome, and the method by which he overcame each of them was the same in its essential structure even though the specific tactics were different. And understanding that essential structure is understanding what the Anansi tradition is teaching. The python was overcome through its vanity, its investment in the story it told about itself, the story that it was the biggest, the longest, the most powerful, and the way this story made it vulnerable to a challenge that invited it to prove itself. The leopard was overcome through its trust, its willingness to accept help from a figure it had underestimated, the way that power often becomes most vulnerable in the moments when it extends its hand to lift something it considers beneath it. The hornets were overcome through their instinct, the automatic, unthinking response to a familiar stimulus, the way that creatures of pure instinct can be predicted and therefore managed by a mind that observes patterns. Vanity, trust, and instinct, these are not weaknesses specific to pythons and leopards and hornets, they are weaknesses specific to power in general, the ways that power makes itself vulnerable through its own nature. And the spider who understands these weaknesses and is patient enough and observant enough and creative enough to use them is not simply getting lucky or using tricks in the trivial sense of that word. He is practicing a sophisticated form of strategic intelligence that takes the world as it actually is, as a place where strength is not equally distributed, where the powerful have genuine advantages, where a spider is genuinely smaller and weaker than a python, and finds within that actual world the specific leverage points where intelligence can overcome force. This is not a minor lesson. For people living under conditions of genuine political and social and economic domination, for enslaved people, for colonized people, for anyone whose life is organized around power they cannot match directly. The trickster's method is not just entertainment, it is instruction, and it is instruction in something that the more straightforwardly heroic traditions of the warrior and the founding king cannot provide, which is how to survive and resist and maintain your humanity when direct. Confrontation is not possible or not advisable. The spread of the Anansi tradition across the Atlantic world with the enslaved Akan people is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of cultural transmission, and it is worth understanding in its full significance because it illustrates something important about what legends are and how they travel. The people who were taken from the Akan homeland in what is now Ghana and carried across the Atlantic in the ships of the transatlantic slave trade. People who lost everything that could be physically taken from them, their land, their freedom, their families, their language in many cases, their names, carried Anansi with them, not as a physical object but as a story, And the story survived the crossing and took root in the New World and spread and adapted to the specific conditions of enslaved life in the Caribbean and the Americas, becoming something that both preserved the connection to the Akan homeland and became genuinely new in the specific soil it found itself growing in. In the Caribbean, Anansi became Anansi, and the Anansi stories developed their own specific characters shaped by the specific conditions of plantation slavery. A world where the spider's methods were not just philosophically interesting but practically necessary, where the ability to outthink an overseer or navigate the rules of the plantation system with creative intelligence was not a luxury but a survival skill, where the trickster's wisdom about power and vulnerability was immediately and urgently relevant to the daily reality of the people telling the stories. The Anansi tradition survived the Middle Passage and survived slavery and survived colonialism and is still alive in the Caribbean, in the Americas, in the African diaspora worldwide, and its survival is not an accident or a curiosity. It is a testament to the specific kind of knowledge the tradition carries. Knowledge that has been relevant in every generation since Anansi first acquired the stories from Niam. Relevant because the conditions that make trickster wisdom necessary have not disappeared, because power is still not equally distributed, because the spider is still sometimes smaller than the python and needs to find another way. The 11th legend, Sunbura, the wandering king nobody can find. There is a figure who appears in several West African traditions, the traditions of the Sahel, the great band of savanna and semi-desert that stretches across the continent below the Sahara. A figure who is described as a great king, a ruler of extraordinary power and wisdom, who disappeared from history in a specific way, not through death or defeat, but through a kind of withdrawal, a deliberate departure from the visible world into something else, leaving behind followers who believed and continue to believe that he will return when the need is great enough. The figure goes by different names in different traditions, and the specific details of the story vary significantly between versions, but the essential structure is consistent enough that it clearly represents a recognizable legendary type, the hidden or sleeping king, the ruler who did not die but withdrew, who waits in a state between absence and presence, available to be called upon in the right circumstances by the right people using the right approach. This type, the hidden king, the ruler who sleeps and will return, is not unique to Africa. It appears in legendary traditions worldwide, from the Welsh legend of Arthur sleeping in his cave to the Japanese legends of hidden emperors, and its appearance across such widely separated cultures suggests that it represents something deep in the human imaginative relationship with leadership and loss, the refusal to accept that the best that a community has known is permanently gone, the preservation of hope in the form of a story about return. In the specific West African context where this type appears, the hidden king tradition often attached itself to real historical figures, rulers whose actual fates were unknown or uncertain, whose deaths were not witnessed or whose bodies were never recovered, creating a space of ambiguity that the legendary imagination filled with the story of withdrawal rather than death, with the possibility of return rather than the finality of absence. The uncertainty was the seed of the legend. In the gap between what was known and what was not, the tradition planted something that served the community better than an admission of ignorance would have served it. And the legend that grew in that gap was not simply a comfortable fiction, it was a form of political and cultural continuity, a way of maintaining the authority and the values associated with the historical king in a period after his reign had ended, using the story of his potential return to keep alive the standards he represented and the expectations his rule had established. The 12th legend, the Amazons of Dahomey. Real warriors. Impossible legends. The Agoji, the female warriors of the kingdom of Dahomey, the women who served as elite soldiers in the royal army of what is now Benin, the women whose story was brought to global attention in the 21st century, and who have been described as the real-world inspiration for the legendary Amazons of ancient Greek accounts, are one of the most fascinating cases in tonight's entire discussion, because their situation is almost the exact reverse of most of the figures we have examined. Most of the figures we have discussed tonight were real people whose stories grew into legend, whose historical reality became obscured by the mythological elaboration that the tradition built around them, whose specific human characteristics were smoothed away to produce the cleaner, more consistent figure that the legend required. The Agoge were real, documented by European observers, described in the accounts of slave traders and missionaries and diplomats who visited the kingdom of Dahomey, recorded in the oral traditions of Dahomey itself, numbering at their peak in the thousands and serving as a genuine and formidable component of the Dahomeyan military for nearly 2 centuries. But the legend that grew around them, particularly in the Western imagination, where the idea of African female warriors seems so surprising and so dramatic that it generated a specific kind of mythologizing, transformed them in the other direction, not from complicated historical people into clean legends, but from a specific, historically grounded military institution into a symbol of something that the Western imagination found both compelling and difficult, a symbol that was used for purposes, feminist, Afrofuturist, colonial, anti-colonial, that the Agoge themselves could not have imagined, and that often had more to do with the needs of the people doing the symbolizing than with the historical reality of the women being symbolized. The historical Agoge were soldiers in the service of a kingdom, the kingdom of Dahomey, whose wealth and power rested in significant part on its role in the transatlantic slave trade, a kingdom that raided neighboring peoples and sold the people it captured to European slavers in exchange for the weapons and goods that sustained its military power, and the Agoge were participants in this system, soldiers who carried out the raids that produced the captives who were sold into the trade. This historical reality is not something that the legend of the Agoge as symbols of African female power and resistance can easily accommodate, because it complicates the clean narrative of warrior women resisting oppression with the more uncomfortable narrative of warrior women participating in a system of oppression that caused immense suffering to millions of people. The legend smooths this away, as legends always smooth away what complicates the essential message, and what remains is the image of strength and independence and the refusal to be limited by gender. An image that is real, grounded in something genuinely present in the historical record, but that has been separated from the specific historical context that shaped it, and in that separation has become more useful as a symbol and less honest as a history. This is not an argument against celebrating the Agoge or finding meaning and inspiration in their story. It is an argument for the kind of historical honesty that can hold the inspiring elements and the troubling elements of a tradition simultaneously, without needing to choose one and discard the other. Real history is always this complicated, and the legends that simplify it always pay a price for the simplification, even when the simplified version serves important purposes. The 13th legend, the Great Rain Queen. Majaji and the women who became mythology. The Balabidu people of the Limpopo region of what is now South Africa have been ruled, for centuries, by a queen whose title is Majaji, the Rain Queen, a woman whose ability to call rain and to withhold it is the foundation of her authority and the basis of a legendary reputation that spread far beyond the Balabita homeland and that attracted, over the centuries, the attention of neighboring kings and European explorers, and eventually the popular imagination of the entire world. The Rain Queens were real, a historical succession of women rulers in the Balabidu tradition, documented from at least the 16th century, whose political authority was inseparable from their ritual role as controllers of rain in a region where rainfall was both essential and unpredictable, and the specific qualities of the Rain Queen tradition, including the rules of succession and the ritual practices associated with the rain-calling ceremonies, are documented in both the oral tradition of the Balabidu and in the records of outside observers who encountered the tradition over centuries. What is not real in the historical sense is the specific supernatural capability attributed to Majaji, the actual ability to call rain through ritual action. But the interesting question about Majaji is not whether she could literally make rain fall, it is how the belief in that capability functioned in the political and social life of the Balabidu and the surrounding communities that accepted it. The belief that the Rain Queen controlled the rain was a form of political authority that operated through entirely real mechanisms, even if the underlying claim was not literally true. Neighboring kings who believed in Majaji's power treated the Balabidu kingdom with a respect and a caution that a small kingdom without the rain-calling legend might not have commanded, and this respect translated into real political protection, into alliances that had real consequences for the safety and the continuity of the Balabidu people. The legend of Majaji's power protected the Balabidu in the same way that a military capability protects a kingdom, not through the actual exercise of the capability in every confrontation, but through the deterrent effect of the belief that the capability existed, the awareness in potential adversaries that moving against the Rain Queen was to risk consequences that could not be predicted or controlled. This is a remarkable political achievement, built not from armies or economic power but from a story so consistently maintained and so carefully embedded in the surrounding culture that it functioned as a genuine deterrent. The legend was the strategy. The story was the weapon. And it worked. The Balabidu kingdom survived, in conditions that destroyed many more powerful neighbors, and the Rain Queen tradition continued, and Majaji remained a figure of genuine authority and genuine cultural significance in the region, documented and discussed and wondered at by European observers who arrived expecting to find nothing remarkable in this part of the world, and found instead a woman whose legendary power commanded more respect than their own military technology in the specific context of that specific community. What connects all the figures in tonight's segment? Anansi the spider who owns all stories, the wandering hidden kings of the Sahel, the Agoji whose real history was transformed into legend, Majaji the Rain Queen whose legendary power was real in its effects, is a single underlying truth about how legends work and what they are for. A truth that has been present in tonight's conversation from the very beginning, but that becomes clearest when you look at the full range of legendary types and ask what they have in common. They are all forms of power, different forms operating through different mechanisms serving different purposes, but power nonetheless, the power of a community to constitute itself, to define what it values and what it fears and what it believes is possible, to maintain that definition across time and across conditions of pressure, to transmit it to the next generation in a form that the next generation can use. The warrior legend says, "This is what our people are capable of in extremity." The founding ancestor says, "This is where we come from and therefore what we are." The healer and the prophet say, "This is what our relationship to the invisible world looks like and what it gives us." The trickster says, "This is how we survive when direct power is unavailable to us." The Rain Queen says, "This is what it looks like when knowledge and belief and political intelligence combine to create something that functions like power, even when conventional power is absent." And the figure who never existed but who everyone thinks was real, this figure says something that is perhaps the most important thing of all, which is that the human need for stories of greatness, stories of possibility, stories of what can be done and what can be survived, is so fundamental and so real that it will generate those stories even when the historical record does not provide them. Because the record of what happened is not the only thing that matters, because what a people believes about what is possible shapes what actually becomes possible, because the legend, even when it is not history, is a form of truth. The night is very deep now, soft and complete, and your body has been carrying you through a long journey tonight, through stories that are old and complicated and rich with the kind of meaning that takes time to settle, and the settling is happening now, gradually. The way things settle in the deep hours when the urgency of the day has finally gone quiet, and the mind can let go of the need to hold everything actively, and just let it find its own level. Your breathing is slower than it was, and your body is heavier than it was, and the stories are still there, not demanding attention anymore, but present. The way things you have genuinely taken in are present, not on the surface but deeper, in the place where the things that actually matter to you live. There is one more part to this story, the last segment, the one that ties everything together, the one that asks what all of this means for the people alive right now who inherit these legends, who live inside them, who are shaped by them in ways they may not always notice or name. That part is waiting for you, patient and steady, on the other side of whatever rest your body needs right now. Let the night be what it is, enormous and quiet and full of the particular peace of the late hours, and let yourself be carried by it, gently and completely, into the deeper dark that is waiting just ahead. What the legend leaves behind. There is a moment that happens in the life of almost every person who grows up inside a tradition, inside the stories of a family, a community, a people, when something shifts in the relationship between the person and the stories they have been given. It is not always a dramatic moment, not always a single identifiable instant when everything changes, but it happens in some form to almost everyone who thinks carefully about the world they were born into and the stories that shaped it. And it is the moment when the person realizes that the stories are stories, that the legends are legends, that the figures who seemed as solid and as real as the ground beneath their feet are made of something different from rock or soil, made of language and memory and the accumulated need of generations of people who told them because they needed them. And this moment, this realization, can go in several different directions depending on the person and the tradition and the specific circumstances of the realization. And which direction it goes determines a great deal about what the person does with the rest of their intellectual and cultural life. It can go toward dismissal, toward the conclusion that if the stories are not literally true, then they are not true at all, that the legends are simply errors to be corrected, comfortable fictions to be outgrown, the childhood of a culture that a mature and modern people should leave behind in favor of the harder and cleaner truth of documented history and verified fact. It can go toward defensiveness, toward the insistence that the stories are literally true despite the evidence, that the historical questions are irrelevant or threatening or the product of a framework that does not apply to the tradition, that the legend must be protected from examination because examination is itself a form of attack. Or it can go somewhere more interesting than either of these, toward the recognition that the stories being stories does not make them less true, that legend and history are different kinds of truth rather than competitors for the same ground, that the question of what actually happened and the question of what the story means are both real questions and neither cancels the other. Tonight has been trying to go to this third place, and this final segment is about what you find when you get there, what it looks like to hold a legend honestly, with full respect for both its cultural significance and its historical complexity, and what that honest holding makes possible that neither dismissal nor defensiveness can provide. Begin with the people who are alive right now, today, who live inside the legends we have discussed tonight, not as distant historical questions, but as living realities that shape their daily experience of who they are. A Yoruba person alive today who grew up hearing the story of Moremi Ajisoro does not experience that story primarily as a historical claim about a specific woman in a specific century, They experience it as part of the fabric of what it means to be Yoruba, as one of the stories through which their identity was formed and through which the values of their community were transmitted to them, as something that lives in them not as information but as orientation, as a way of understanding what women are capable of and what sacrifice means and what the relationship between an individual and their community asks of the people who are part of it. Whether Moremi was a historical person does not change any of this, because the story's work in the person's life is not dependent on its historical accuracy. It is dependent on its cultural and moral truth, on the fact that the values it embodies are real values that the tradition has genuinely held, and that those values have shaped real people in real ways across many generations. An Ethiopian person who grew up with the Kebre Nagast and the story of Makeda does not need the historical Makeda to have walked into Solomon's court for the story to have done its work. The story has already done its work. It has already shaped the way Ethiopian identity understands itself, its relationship to the sacred, its sense of historical significance, the pride in a civilization that can trace its roots to the most ancient and honored sources. An Amande person who grew up hearing the Sundiata epic from a griot does not experience the story as a claim about what happened at the Battle of Carina in 1235 CE. They experience it as a demonstration of what is possible, as the griot's gift to every person in the audience who has ever been told that what they hope for cannot happen, that the disability or the exile or the powerlessness they are living in is their permanent condition rather than the first chapter of a story that has not finished being told. These are not small things, and they do not become smaller when you know that the history behind them is more complicated than the story suggests. There is a scholar whose work has shaped how many people think about this question, a Ghanaian philosopher named Kwame Anthony Appiah, who has written with great clarity and great honesty about the relationship between African identity, African tradition, and the challenge of holding cultural inheritance critically without abandoning it, and who has described something he calls the tension between what he calls the received stories and the critical examination those stories deserve. Appiah does not resolve this tension by choosing one side. He does not say that the critical examination should always win, that the received stories should be corrected or abandoned when they fail historical scrutiny, and he does not say that the received stories should be protected from examination in the name of cultural respect. He says that the tension itself is productive, that living inside the tension, holding both the inheritance and the critique, being someone who was formed by these stories and who also thinks carefully about what they actually are, is not a position of contradiction but a position of intellectual and cultural maturity, the position of someone who has genuinely engaged with their tradition rather than simply accepting or rejecting it. This seems right, and it seems relevant to everything tonight has been exploring. The willingness to sit inside the complexity of a legendary figure like Makeda or Sundiata or Shaka, to hold simultaneously the historical questions and the cultural significance, to neither dismiss the legend as fiction nor protect it from inquiry as sacred. This willingness is not weakness or disrespect, or the product of a framework that does not belong to the tradition. It is, in fact, the most honest and the most respectful engagement that the tradition can receive. The engagement that takes it seriously enough to actually think about it, that trusts it enough to ask hard questions without fearing that the questions will destroy what matters most about it. The legends that have lasted, the ones we have discussed tonight, the ones that have survived centuries and disruptions and the specific violence of colonialism and its aftermath, these legends are strong enough to be questioned, and the questioning does not diminish them, it deepens them, it reveals the layers of meaning and function that simple acceptance would have kept invisible. There is something specific that happens to the legendary figures of African tradition in the context of the diaspora, in the communities of African-descended people in the Americas and the Caribbean and Europe, communities whose connection to the specific cultural traditions of the African continent was disrupted by the violence of the slave trade. And this specific thing is worth examining carefully because it illuminates something about the nature of legendary figures that is different from what we can see when we look at the traditions in their original contexts. The diaspora communities who carried African legendary traditions across the Atlantic, who carried Anansi and the Yoruba Orishas and the various figures and stories that survived the crossing, did not carry them as museum pieces, as preserved artifacts of a culture that had been left behind. They carried them as living things, and the way living things respond to new environments is by changing, by adapting, by finding new forms that can survive in the new conditions while maintaining the essential life that was there from the beginning. Anansi in Jamaica is not the same as Anansi in Ghana, and the difference is not corruption or distortion, it is adaptation, the trickster spider finding the specific form that the specific conditions of plantation slavery and post-slavery Caribbean life required, the philosophy of the trickster being applied to a specific political and social reality that the original tradition could not have anticipated. The Orisha tradition that became Candomblé in Brazil and Santeria in Cuba and Vodou in Haiti is not the same as the Yoruba tradition that it grew from, and again the difference is not loss or distortion but adaptation. The spirits finding the specific forms and the specific relationships with their devotees that the specific conditions of enslaved and post-enslaved life in the New World called for. And the figures who became legendary in this diaspora context, the heroes and the ancestors and the symbolic figures who shaped the identity of African-descended communities in the New World, are a combination of the transported African traditions and the specific New World experiences that those communities lived through, and they carry both origins simultaneously. And the carrying of both is not confusion but richness, not instability but the particular kind of complexity that genuinely living traditions always have. Frederick Douglass is a legendary figure in the African American tradition, and his historical existence is fully documented, and his legend has been shaped by the same processes that shape all legends: the emphasis of certain qualities, the smoothing of certain complexities, the projection of symbolic meaning onto a historical person whose actual life was more complicated than the legend accommodates. And understanding this does not make him less significant, it makes the significance more honest and more durable. Harriet Tubman is a legendary figure, and her historical existence is fully documented, and her legend has grown to a size that the historical person, remarkable as she was, could not entirely fill, and the legend is doing work that the historical person alone could not do, sustaining a tradition of resistance and courage and the refusal to accept the conditions imposed by power. And this work is real and valuable, even when the specific details of the legend have grown beyond what the historical record can support. The legendary figures of the African tradition and the legendary figures of the diaspora tradition are doing the same thing. They are carrying the values and the possibilities and the identity of their communities forward through time, in a form that is durable and transmissible and capable of being taken up by each new generation, and made into something that serves the specific needs of that generation's specific situation. This brings us to something that is perhaps the most important thing in tonight's entire conversation, something that all the specific figures and all the specific stories have been building toward without naming directly, and it is this: the legends that a community holds about itself are not simply reflections of what the community believes. They are also constitutions, frameworks that define what the community is permitted to become, what is considered possible and what is considered impossible, what kinds of people and what kinds of actions are celebrated and what kinds are made invisible or shameful. A community whose legends celebrate only warriors and kings will produce a specific kind of imagination about what is possible, an imagination that has room for certain kinds of greatness and not others, that can envision certain kinds of leadership and not others, that will recognize certain kinds of achievement and remain blind to others. A community whose legends include tricksters alongside warriors, healers alongside kings, founding mothers alongside founding fathers, ordinary farmers alongside extraordinary rulers. This community has a wider imagination, can recognize greatness in more forms, can sustain a more diverse and more honest understanding of what its people are and have been and can become. The legends we have discussed tonight, across all their variety, across all their different cultural origins and different historical periods and different kinds of truth, collectively represent exactly this kind of breadth, and the breadth itself is part of the tradition's significance, the insistence that African humanity is not one thing but many, that the continent's legendary inheritance is not a single story but a library, vast and varied and full of voices that do not all agree with each other and that are richer for the disagreement. Makeda and Anansi and Moremi and the Agoji and Majaji and Sundiata. They are not telling the same story, they are not representing the same values or the same understanding of what matters or the same answer to the question of how a person should live, and this diversity of models, this multiplicity of legendary possibilities, is one of the most important things the tradition preserves and one of the most important gifts it offers to the people who inherit it. There is a question that has been present in tonight's conversation from the very beginning, present in the title of tonight's story, present in the way the question was framed, African legends who never existed but everyone thinks were real, a question that sounds like it is about historical accuracy, but that is actually about something more interesting and more important. The question is not really did these people exist. That is the surface of the question, the form it takes when you first encounter it, but underneath it, in the place where the real question lies, it is asking something else. It is asking what it means to believe in something, what the relationship is between a person and a story, between a community and its legends, between the need for greatness and the availability of historical examples of it, between the stories we tell about ourselves and the people we become through the telling. And the answer that tonight has been working toward, the answer that all the specific figures and all the specific stories have been building together, is that the relationship between a person and a story is not simply a matter of belief or disbelief, not simply a matter of historical accuracy or inaccuracy, but something more fundamental and more human than either of those frameworks can fully contain. The relationship between a person and a story is the relationship between a life being lived and the language available for living it, between the specific, daily, irreducibly individual experience of being a human being in a particular body in a particular place at a particular time, and the larger patterns of meaning and possibility that make that specific experience legible, that give it a context and a shape and a connection to something beyond itself. The legends we have discussed tonight exist in that relationship. They are not simply stories about specific people who may or may not have existed. They are the language through which generations of African people have made their specific lives legible to themselves and to each other, have found the patterns that make individual experience part of something larger, have maintained the connection between the particular and the universal that is one of the deepest needs of human consciousness. And the fact that some of these legends are not historically accurate does not diminish this function. It almost deepens it, because a legend that persists despite its historical complexity, that survives the critical examination that modernity has brought to all traditions, that continues to carry its meaning even when the historical person at its center is revealed to be less certain than the legend suggested. This legend has proven something about itself, has demonstrated that the truth it carries is robust enough to survive the pressure of historical inquiry, that it is not dependent on the specific historical facts for its essential meaning. Makeda may or may not have walked into Solomon's court, and the Solomonic dynasty may or may not be literally descended from their union, and the Ark of the Covenant may or may not rest in Aksum, and the Ethiopia that was shaped by this story the national identity that carried its people through centuries of pressure and one of the most significant anti-colonial military victories in history. This Ethiopia is real, and it was made in part by the story and the story's power to make it does not depend on the historical accuracy of its specific claims. Sundiata may or may not have bent an iron bar, and Semanguru may or may not have had a supernatural vulnerability to a rooster's spur, and the Battle of Kirina may or may not have unfolded exactly as the griot's epic describes, and the Mali Empire that Sundiata is credited with founding was one of the great civilizations of the medieval world, and the Mande people who have carried his story across 8 centuries have maintained through it an understanding of what they are capable of that has sustained them through conditions that would have extinguished communities without that kind of deep cultural memory. This is what legends do in their most essential and most irreducible function. They maintain the memory of possibility in the people who hold them. They keep alive the knowledge that extraordinary things have been done and therefore can be done, that the present conditions of a community are not its permanent conditions, that what seems impossible in the current moment has been overcome before and can be overcome again. And this function, this essential, irreplaceable, deeply human function, is not dependent on the historical accuracy of the specific examples that carry it. It is dependent on the quality of the telling, on the fidelity of the tradition to the values it is supposed to embody, on the capacity of the legend to continue generating meaning in new circumstances without losing its essential character. The legends we have discussed tonight have this quality, every one of them, and this quality is the real answer to the question of their existence, the only answer that finally matters, the answer that is not about whether a specific person walked on a specific piece of ground in a specific century, but about what the story of that person has done in the world and continues to do, what it has given to the people who have held it, and what it asks of the people who inherit it. The legends are real in the only sense that ultimately matters. They are real in their effects, real in the lives they have shaped, real in the identities they have constituted and the resistances they have sustained and the possibilities they have kept alive across the long, difficult, extraordinary history of the African people and their descendants across the world. Let your body grow heavy now, settling all the way down into wherever you are resting tonight, into the surface that is holding you, supported completely and held without effort, and let your breathing find the slow, deep rhythm that your body knows how to find when it is finally allowed to rest, the rhythm that does not require any attention or any maintenance, that simply continues on its own, carrying you toward the sleep that has been waiting for you through the whole of this long night. The stories we have traveled through tonight are settling inside you now, not loudly, not all at once, but slowly, the way things settle in the deep hours, finding their level, finding the place in you where they belong, where they will live quietly and do their work in the way that things that have genuinely entered you always do their work, below the surface, in the slow and patient process of becoming part of how you understand the world. Mercator is in there somewhere now, the queen who may or may not have been historical and who was real in every way that mattered, whose story built a nation's sense of itself and sustained it through centuries of pressure, whose name carries the weight of everything that the Ethiopian tradition most needed to believe about where it came from and what it deserved. Sundiata is in there, the child who could not walk and walked anyway, the exile who returned, the man who became the legend that became the permission for every person who heard his story to believe that their own impossible destiny was not as impossible as it seemed. Anansi is in there, the spider who owns all stories, including this one, including every story ever told or heard or carried across an ocean in the only luggage that could not be taken away, the luggage of memory and meaning and the deep knowledge of how intelligence overcomes force when the intelligence is patient enough and observant enough to find the specific vulnerability that power always carries within itself. And all the others, Nzinga and Moremi and the Rain Queen and the Agoji and Gikuyu and Mumbai, all of them in there now, settling, becoming part of the architecture of how you see the world and what you understand about what is possible and what has been done and what the long, complicated, extraordinary human tradition of telling stories about greatness has been for, and what it has given to every person who ever sat by a fire and listened and let the story in. Let your eyes be heavy, really heavy, the particular heaviness of eyes that have seen enough for tonight and are ready to close, and let the seeing continue in the different way that sleeping sees, the way that the mind processes and integrates and makes its own meaning from what the waking hours have offered it. Let your hands rest, open and still, no longer needing to hold anything. Let your shoulders drop, releasing the last of whatever the day asks them to carry. Let the night be what it is, enormous and old and patient, the same night that was above every fire where every one of tonight's stories was first told, the same darkness that Makeda traveled through on her way to Jerusalem, that Sundiata stood in on the morning of Karina, that Anansi spun his silk through on the way to Niam's sky, the same night, patient and vast and full of all the stories that have ever been told in it. And you are in it now, held by it, carried by it, drifting in the way that only the deep hours carry you, down and down and down into the quiet where the stories live when the telling has stopped and the listening has finished and there is nothing left to do but rest. The legends are real in the only way that finally matters. And so are you. And so is this. This dark. This quiet. This breath. Going in, and out, and in. Good night.